In just over 4 minutes, you could finish listening to a pop song or make a cup of tea, but in those same minutes, a massive ship called the MV Dolly was heading for a disaster that would shock the world. This was the time they had from when everything went dark to when they hit the Francis Scott Key Bridge. Imagine the chaos. A huge ship, longer than 3 football fields, racing uncontrollably toward a famous bridge. The crew was in the dark, literally, as power failed and alarms blared. The ship was blind and moving fast. Cameras caught the moment the lights flickered back on and the crew tried to turn the ship away, but it was too late. Thick black smoke filled the air, a bad sign. 26 a.m., just as things seemed to get better, everything went dark again. The captain called for help, asking for tugboats to come quickly. It was their first cry for help and it set off a scramble on land. The authorities were alerted. They knew a powerless, steeringless giant was sliding towards the bridge. As the tension mounted, the captain made a drastic decision. Drop the port anchor to slow them down. Despite additional commands being issued, their exact nature remains unknown. Only 5 seconds later, the lights flickered back on, a brief sign of hope that was quickly dashed. 15 seconds after that, the captain sent out a mayday call. The ship was completely powerless again and dangerously close to the bridge. On land, the urgency was palpable.
I need one of you on the south side, one on the north.
An officer directed his team to halt all traffic on the Key Bridge. There's a ship approaching. I've just lost their steering. The last vehicle cleared the bridge just seconds before 1:28 a.m. Then, with its anchor dragging, the Dolly struck the bridge at about 7 knots. The impact was devastating. Like a house of cards, a section of the bridge crumbled and fell. The Transportation Authority could only report the collapse, having known about the potential disaster just a minute and a half before the ship made contact. Despite the dire situation, swift actions by patrol units to close the bridge helped avoid even more tragedy. However, 8 construction workers caught in the middle of overnight repairs weren't as fortunate. The bridge's collapse sent them plunging about 50 feet into the icy waters below, turning a critical incident into a desperate rescue operation. With water temperatures at a chilling 48 degrees Fahrenheit, rescuers raced against time to save lives. Of those caught in the disaster, 2 workers were quickly pulled from the freezing water. One was rushed to the hospital while the other, remarkably, declined further medical care. As the day wore on, the situation grew more somber with 6 workers still missing. The community and their families waited in anguish, wondering why the MV Dolly, a massive ship controlled by advanced technology, could not be stopped. The Dolly, constructed by Hyundai Heavy Industries in South Korea in 2015 and operated by Maersk, was no old vessel. It had passed inspections as recently as 3 months ago with no significant issues reported, yet on that fateful night it faced a total blackout. Both the engine and the ship's electrical systems failed simultaneously. Although the diesel backup generator managed to restore some electrical functions, it wasn't enough to regain control of the ship or prevent the disaster. This complete loss of power raised urgent questions about the vessel's operational integrity and the effectiveness of its safety systems despite recent clear inspections. The plume of black smoke that followed the restoration of electrical power was likely a sign of the generator kicking in, a small consolation that came too late. James Marcante, a maritime expert, explained just how tricky the situation was. Without power or steering, the MV Dolly was like a giant piece of driftwood, floating uncontrollably at 8 knots. Stopping such a huge ship isn't quick or easy. Even with anchors down, it would take the length of 5 or 6 football fields to come to a full stop. Despite these challenges, the experts agreed. The pilots did everything within their power. The quick decision to send out a mayday call wasn't just protocol, it was a life-saving action. On board the Dolly were 2 pilots, both familiar with Baltimore's waters. It's a rule. Big ships flying foreign flags need local pilots to navigate through US ports. These pilots know every twist and turn of the local channels like the back of their hand. They're usually brought to the ship by a smaller boat or even a helicopter while it's still moving. Once aboard, they don't take over completely. They're there to guide. They meet with the ship's captain, discuss the best way out of the harbor, and give directions. But ultimately, it's the captain who's in charge. The first pilot, with over a decade of experience navigating these tricky waters, knew his job well. The second was newer, an apprentice just starting out last month, learning the ropes in a high-stakes environment. While the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, is still investigating and might take months to release a final report, their quick involvement highlights just how critical it is to understand why the MV Dolly lost power. But there's another big question. Why did the bridge collapse so completely, like a house of cards? Built in March 1977 for $60 million and named after the writer of the American national anthem, this bridge was a marvel of its time. Its main span was the 3rd longest among continuous truss bridges worldwide. A recent federal inspection in May 2022 rated the bridge as fair, but it did raise some concerns, particularly about a reinforced concrete column whose condition was worsening. It's still unclear if this was the column that got hit. A structural engineer interviewed on TV explained that the bridge met all the standards it was supposed to. However, the design of the bridge itself might have been its downfall. Constructed as a continuous truss bridge without any cable supports, the entire structure depended heavily on each of its piers. If just one pier is damaged or removed, it greatly affects the stability and integrity of the whole bridge. This design choice meant that hitting just the right spot could lead to a dramatic collapse, just as we saw. When one of the bridge's piers was struck, it doubled the load on the next pier. This imbalance caused the bridge to buckle under its own weight. This raises a question. Could hitting a different part of the bridge have minimized the damage? If the ship had struck the deck instead of a crucial support pillar, the impact might have been distributed more evenly, possibly avoiding a complete collapse. However, the vulnerability of the bridge prompts another question. Shouldn't there have been better protections in place? Looking back at the Sunshine Skyway Bridge disaster in 1980, where inadequate crash walls failed to stop a ship, we learn that such barriers were too small to absorb a ship's impact effectively. Since that accident, there has been a focus on improving bridge designs and protective barriers to withstand collisions. Unfortunately, these improvements came too late for the Francis Scott Key Bridge, which was built before these new standards were adopted in 1991. Moreover, in the 1970s, container ships were much smaller, meaning that older bridges like the Key Bridge weren't designed to withstand impacts from the much larger modern vessels. This mismatch contributed to the scale of the disaster. In response to the collapse, a state of emergency was declared, and $60 million in emergency funds were allocated not only for clearing the debris, but also for beginning reconstruction efforts. The initial hope of finding survivors quickly faded, turning the rescue effort into a grim recovery mission. The day after the bridge collapsed, a heart-rending discovery was made. Divers found a red pickup truck submerged 25 feet deep in the murky waters, its 2 occupants still inside. This tragic find was part of a larger, sorrowful picture. 6 workers, none from the US, had perished in this disaster. According to their colleagues, these men were simply taking a break in their trucks when the bridge gave way. This discovery came just moments before officials deemed the diving conditions too dangerous to continue, shifting the focus to clearing the debris. The cleanup involved several critical steps: removing tons of heavy steel and concrete from the river, securing the hazardous materials from 56 containers, and eventually lifting nearly 3,000 feet of the collapsed bridge's structure from the water. As crews worked tirelessly to clear the channel, the NTSB continued its investigation to determine responsibility. It emerged that Bronner Builders, the employer of the 6 deceased workers, had not provided a mandatory safety skiff, and there was no rescue boat on site, despite federal requirements. Meanwhile, the city of Baltimore faced significant challenges. The closure of the bridge severely disrupted traffic flows. Approximately 30,000 vehicles had used it daily. The port, a critical hub for cars and light trucks, handling 500,000 passengers and over 10 million tons of cargo annually, now faced delays. With the bridge out, vehicles and cargo were rerouted, causing congestion and delaying shipments for weeks. Plans to rebuild the Francis Scott Key Bridge and restore port operations are in motion, though experts predict the work could extend over a year. This devastating incident highlights a critical vulnerability. Many US bridges lack adequate impact protection. With nearly 3% considered fracture critical, their failure could lead to catastrophic outcomes. Maryland, significantly impacted by this tragedy, is among the states most at risk. This event echoes the lessons of the Sunshine Skyway Bridge disaster nearly half a century ago, raising an urgent question. Will this tragedy finally compel the federal government to enforce updated safety measures for older bridges? As for today, the dramatic and unfortunate events surrounding the collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge and the subsequent investigations have taken a new turn with the involvement of the FBI and other legal maneuvers. The FBI confirmed their presence aboard the Dolly, conducting what they described as court-authorized law enforcement activity. This statement came alongside a broader announcement from the city of Baltimore about partnering with law firms to launch legal action against those deemed responsible for the collapse. This expanded investigation aims to uncover whether there were systemic failures within the company's operations that could have contributed to the disaster. Critics and observers have raised concerns about whether the company cut corners on safety protocols or neglected proper maintenance and checks on their vessels. On the same day, a fourth victim of the collapse was recovered by the authorities. This recovery adds a somber note to the ongoing efforts, as the search continues for other missing crew members. The recovery process has been fraught with danger, with large sections of the bridge and heavy steel pieces complicating the efforts. Thank you for watching. If this video was informative, please like, comment, and consider subscribing for more in-depth analysis. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light.